Hello, and welcome to today's Sage HCM Learning Series. My name is Steve Tompkins, Principal Solutions Architect, and I'm here today to talk to you about payroll processing. So let's go ahead and move forward a little bit here. As you can see, payroll processing. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to just basically go right into the system here so we can look at this. So just give me one moment to switch over to my browser. And we'll be able to look at this here. We're going to look at it kind of holistically here from the time to employee maintenance and then into payroll processing. So just give me 1 second to switch this over to my browser. I do want to mention as I'm doing this that we do have a chat where you can ask questions there. If something comes up, we are monitoring that and we'll try to answer those questions as we can. And then if we cannot answer those questions, we'll follow up with you to make sure that we get them answered for you. So let's go ahead and jump into the system here. So, of course, payroll processing, almost all of it's going to happen behind the scenes in administration. However, the employees can contribute a little bit to this, of course, in a few different ways. First off, they may need to make tax changes and or direct deposit bank changes and those types of things, which they could do through self-service or the mobile app, depending on how you have their settings configured and their rights. So as an example, they may go into their bank accounts and update something about their direct deposit or enroll in it if they have not done that in the past. So they might add a bank account, maybe they delete a bank account, make some changes, or whatever those happen to be. And of course, you may have an approval process for this. So this would be part of that employee contribution to that payroll process as they might update or add information into their direct deposit. And of course, they can also do that in their taxes. I will show, I have US taxes here, but it'd be the same process for Canada, where somebody might submit a new W-4, a state tax form in the US, or they might do a new TD-1 in Canada. So, they might fill out their new form and put down whatever their situation is for the single or married and their other dependent claims and so forth down here. So, of course, this also typically would have an approval process on that the payroll processor or whoever it is in your workflow might approve that. The other main contribution to this is going to be through time entry. So the employees, I'm assuming, would be clocking in and out. Now, they don't necessarily have to be using our timesheets. Certainly, we'd love it if they would use our timesheets, but of course, we can get data from many sources, whether it's an ERP where we might bring in the time in from that ERP. Maybe it's a project management or time system, again, where we're bringing that stuff into payroll or into our timesheets. Of course, we might be importing data as well, just like that a spreadsheet or a CSV might be importing that information. So for the timesheet, of course, the employee is going to be clocking in and out throughout the pay period. I have a weekly timesheet, and they'll come in here and they'll make whatever changes they need to do and clocking in and out throughout the week, and of course, eventually, hopefully, submitting their time. Now, maybe a manager, supervisor, foreman, et cetera, might be doing those processes, but this is where their timesheet would be located. And you could see, different fields if you're doing, labor allocations and so forth and different jobs. All of that, of course, would come from the timesheets. From a manager perspective or administrative perspective, you would have your team timesheets. We'll be able to check the status of those timesheets because timesheets need to be approved if you're using our timesheets to bring that data into payroll. I'm going to go back to last pay period because it's the one I'm going to process. And you can see, I believe I have all of them approved. Let me just check here because you can use this status to see is there anything that is not submitted. In fact, I do have two that are not submitted. So I probably want to get those submitted there. And perhaps they have been submitted, but they haven't been approved. So you could check the status is right there. Now, this button would allow me to submit for that person. Of course, this is my employee, so I can actually go to his timesheet and approve it or submit it myself. But you'll see here, I've got two. I can also do a mass submission in here. And this will, of course, for mine, it's going to show that I submitted my own timesheet. But for Daniel here, it'll say that Gary submitted on his behalf. All right. And so you'll see this as an example. They've been submitted. Now I did two of them. So very quick and easy there. And now they're off of this one. However, they're now going to be on the submission right here. So I can see that they've been submitted and perhaps there's verifications that need to happen or other types of approvals. But this is where that payroll user would be able to see the status of those things, hopefully get the managers to approve those. If you like, you can allow payroll approvers to approve timesheets for managers. They could do that right here in the team timesheets by checking this box. This is behind a security right. And so I can go ahead and do this, and then I could say approved for the manager or something like this. The comment is required. So you must put that in there. And then now I'm going to take credit for the approvals. I don't remember who is supposed to be approving it, but I've now done that. Of course, I can also do that in the workflow, but you will want to make sure all of your timesheets are approved. And of course, from here, if I want to go back to all timesheets, maybe you sort it by hours and see, oh, well, these two are missing. Now, maybe they are brand new. They didn't have any hours that week, or perhaps are out on leave or something, or maybe they just weren't scheduled. But you will probably want to check to make sure you've got hours in there. Here, you'll see some people who have 0 hours, but they were approved. So maybe they're on the leave and they just didn't work. All right, so double check these, maybe reach out to the employees and or managers to make sure everything is correct in here. One other source of data, or there's two other sources, but one other source where the employee might be entering information would be their expense reports. So if you're using expense reporting, you'll want to make sure that those expense reports for the period are approved. Now, this is something, there is not a team view of this in here where I can go out there and see all the expenses for all the employees like I can with team timesheets, but they would submit their own expenses. You'll see these are submitted. Some of them are approved. They haven't been paid, and others have been paid here. So I can see, what's going on in this situation. I might need to, as the employee, reach out to my manager and say, how come you haven't submitted or approved my expense report, for this date here? And then the other one where the employee is not going to be entering information, but it is a source of data for payroll, would be commissions. So the employee can see this out here. You can see this on the admin side, but this is also another source of data for payroll. All right, so that's pretty much what's visible here prior to payroll within self-service. Of course, after payroll is processed, employees can see their pay history and so forth. So when I come down, I have the widget enabled called My Pay, and I can see my last payment out here. So for a week ago, I can click on this and bring up my pay stub. And of course, they can go to other years and see that information out there if they need to. So very simple to be able to see that, last year or whatever. I can click into any one of these. These are also available to the employees right here under pay history. Same screen, just different ways of getting there. All right, of course, that won't be populated with this pay stub until we finish payroll. So let's go ahead and look on the admin side of the house here on those types of things you might need to do prior to payroll. So of course, approvals would be one of those things. Maybe tax forms were sent in for you to approve, direct deposit change, maybe new hires and other types of things that might affect people's pay. You'll want to make sure those are approved if they are, going to impact this payroll. Certainly if a, tax form is not going to be effective until the middle of May, I don't necessarily need to approve it for the payroll today. Might want to approve it just to get it off my desk, but you don't have to get it done for this current payroll. Same thing with like direct deposit. Maybe somebody's saying, I'm going to submit it today, but I need it next time. You can go ahead and do that there. All right. Now there might be employee maintenance things that the payroll person is going to do. Of course, I could update a lot of information. However, I'm going to focus in on the payroll stuff here. All right. So certainly banking information and tax information I could do as the payroll processor. Many companies do it that way. They're not having employees do stuff through self-service. Maybe there's just a bunch of people out in the field and they don't have phones to use or whatever, and they do paper copies of stuff. Certainly, you can come into your banking information. You can update and add information here for the employee. Same thing with the taxes. You might have gotten a paper, W-4, you need to update that, or a TD-1, you need to update that. You can definitely do that manually if you need to. All right, deductions. So certainly deductions can come from many different sources. This is a great example. This person has benefit deductions like life insurance, medical, dental, etc. I also have non-benefit deductions as well. For an example, there's a loan here, and there's other things like uniform that payroll typically is going to be updating. So let's just look at this loan as an example. So if you clicked on add up there, it's going to look exactly the same, except for this is read only here. So here you can see when it started, they're doing $86 monthly is how this deduction works, up to $1,000 limits. Now, of course, there might be an expiration date and stuff. So this is stuff that payroll would typically be entering in by just clicking add and selecting the right code. You do not need to do that if you have the benefits in the system, and the benefits will take care of adding the deductions. In fact, if I were to go and change deduction amounts here, the benefits next time they calculate, and some companies do that like on a very regular basis, like daily, it'll update and overwrite what I've done. So if I know, for an example, that this person has changed their 401k from $191 to some other number, I might change it here manually. However, if there's a benefit plan related to it, it will update that back to 191. So I'd want to be careful with that and have, whoever's updating benefits update that for me. All right, so there's that. Of course, incomes. These would be other incomes that might go and get paid to the employee. So here you see as an example, he has a cell phone reimbursement, $60. And this is paid, I think I have this set to be paid monthly. I'd have to go and look at my settings. But paid monthly here, there's no limit on here, so it's just going to keep going. Started last month, and he's going to get that money, every time it's supposed to go. I think it's monthly in my example. And then there's other things here. Now, this bonus, is probably it's been paid out. It was $100 and the lifetime was $100, so it's probably paid out. So this is how I could put it in before payroll if I want to. Now, this is also something I could put in during payroll. In the payroll process screen, I could have a bonus code in payroll, and I just put in the $100, and it would just go for that one payroll. And that might also be something I import in. All right, so just an example of some of the things that you could do here. Here's where I could see those commissions that are visible within self-service. I could see them over here. So this might be something if you're using the commission calculations, and we have had some learning series on commissions, but if you're using that, they might already be here. Perhaps they were imported in from a spreadsheet, something like that, or they maybe were manually added to the employee to have that on there. They might have a commission plan that says pay a certain rate when they, make this much in sales or those types of things. But this is where I can see those commissions that might be outstanding for this period. Same type of thing with expense reports. I could go out there and see the expense reports for employees. I could also manually add one for them if I would like. So if they're not doing it through self-service or mobile and going through the approvals, I can add that to them myself. All right, finally, one of the new features is the referrals. We will have a learning series on this coming up. But the referrals is where there might be a referral bonus that's paid to somebody after a new employee that they had referred worked for 6 months or something along those lines. So that's where I could see that information here. It might have been added when that person was hired, but of course, payroll also might be involved in adding it to employees. So perhaps you're going to be adding that. All right, let's get into the actual processing of payroll. I did want to talk about one extra thing comes up frequently enough. In fact, it's an annual thing, is you do want to make sure you have a pay period schedule, the pay schedule set up so that you can actually run the payroll. You cannot run payroll without a pay schedule. So you'll want to make sure you have one set up, and you'll want to make sure it's set up with the current year. Because if you don't put one in, let's say it's January, you forgot to put it in, you're not going to be able to run payroll because you need to have a schedule to be paid. So make sure this is in here. I do cover this in the year-end training, but I just like to mention this because you might select a payroll schedule and say, why don't I see any pay dates? I don't understand what's going on. It's reading from here. So just make sure the current year is in here. You could go out and you could set up, the next 5 years or something like that if you'd like to. But you'll see here, there's the start and end date. And of course, here's the pay date. Now, maybe these pay dates, if they're Friday, you might need to change them because sometimes a Friday is a holiday. So you might need to bump it up. So you can change those ahead of time. You don't have to do that in the payroll process itself. All right, I'll point that out just so make sure we know how that's in there. And we cover that in the year end as well. So let's go over to payroll. I'm going to start a new payroll batch. So I'll click add batch here. Now I have multiple employers, so I must select an employer here. That's the first thing I have to do. If you only have one employer, that doesn't even show. All right. Or if you only have one access to one employer, maybe you do have multiple employers, but you only process payroll for one of those, you won't see those other employers there. All right. So here you'll see the 3 things that are required. And this is where I was saying the payroll schedule is required. So you must have a payroll schedule in there. And of course, you must have one for the pay period you're trying to pay. So those will be in there. Now, these things can be linked to a pay group. A pay group does a lot of the heavy lifting for you. It's not a requirement, but it does make the things much easier so that it can kind of pre-fill the payroll schedule there. It also includes things like default income codes and so forth. So you can set up a pay group to help you out there. I happen to have three, and let me show you something here. When I select biweekly, you'll notice how the payroll schedule shows biweekly, but I don't have any pay periods set for this year. So that's what I was talking about. You need to have it set up before you can actually process the payroll. All right. So I'm going to choose weekly because I know I have a pay period set up. And here I can see this. Now it's always going to show three right here by default, unless you are at the end of the year, end of the payroll year, and you don't have any for next year. Then you'll only see what you can select. So that's another good indicator when you get towards the end of your payroll year, your fiscal year, whatever that happens to be. If you only see one or two, it means you haven't created your schedule yet for the next year. But here you can see now I'm able to choose this one because my payday is the 19th. So it's always going to show the next payday. And then this is the current one. And you can see, of course, one more out there. If you need to see more, you can choose off cycle. And now you're able to see further back if you have to. All right. And there is a little trick out there. If you need to see one even further back, maybe you needed to um, date something into January. You can go into your payroll schedule and you can change the pay date for a older schedule to today. And then once you've selected it, you could change the pay date to like today or future date and still use that older pay period. So it is a little workaround. If you need to get to an older pay period, you can change the pay date in the schedule and it'll show up here. All right, so I'm going to do an on cycle here. Now, the difference, of course, between on cycle and off cycle is which deductions are going to be calculated. All right, so you might have different deductions. Oops, don't know why I just did there. I wanted to copy, not paste, but different deductions. So you might have like your standard benefit deductions come out on cycle, but when you're doing off cycle, like a bonus run or a termination or something like that, maybe those deductions don't come out and you only have certain deductions that come out. In the settings of deductions is where you would see that on cycle versus off cycle. All right, so now the name is required. It could be anything you like. I recommend you make it unique. I happen to use the pay date here, but you could maybe do like a payroll number, or maybe you want to say the pay period or something like that. It's certainly up to you. And of course, if you're doing an off cycle or just like a one-off payroll, like bonuses, you might want to put down here, Q1 bonuses or something like that. All right, so now it's going to go out and it's going to load all your employees. And when it's doing this, it's checking a number of things in here. One of the key things it's checking is the geocode for your employees. So there may be situations where somebody, and let me show you what I'm talking about exactly, does not have a geocode on their address. All right, so I'm going to go to Paula here. Her address, it is checking to make sure this is a valid geocode. So if I had a blank here, maybe a new hire, and I never populated the geocode, or I imported some data, didn't populate the geocode, you will get a message here that'll say which employee doesn't have a geocode. It will say they do not have a valid geocode. This is where you'd have to go to fix that. All right, so you would just put that right in there. All right, so here are all my employees who are in that pay group, who are active employees in that pay period. Now, this is where I bring in the time, the expense reports, the commissions, possibly the cash out of time off, as well as the referral bonuses. I only have timesheets out there. Now, this is one of those things where you can actually load timesheets before you have them all approved. This is very useful if you have, and I experienced this myself when I process payroll. Some managers are just slower than others getting things approved. And I don't know why I'm getting a message there, but they're slower than others getting things approved out there. And you can't sit here and wait forever for them to get things done. So you can get started and bring in, you know, three-quarters of all the timesheets. And while you're waiting for those two or three managers to get their stuff done, maybe they're stuck in a meeting and it's not really their fault, but you can wait and bring it in a second time or a third time or whatever to get them all in here. So you can do that. It will not duplicate anything on the employee's records there. So if I bring in, let's say, Gary's timesheet, and then, I need to have, some other people get approved, it's not going to go and overwrite Gary's timesheet with that data. This is also where you can load expense reports and commissions. So if I do this here, hopefully I don't get an error. I don't know why I did get that, but here's an outstanding one out here. I can see the details of what's going to get paid. And, I can check off the various ones I want to do there and add those to payroll. All right. I can also import in other information here. You saw commissions, so those would show any commissions that are for this period that are outstanding. Time off cash outs and payouts. Those would be for any time off that you might have set to be paid out on termination, or if you allow people to cash out their vacation. So they might put a request to say, I want to get 40 hours paid vacation, not as time off, but just out of my bank of hours. That's what that would be here. And then finally, the referral bonuses. So if you have any referral bonuses for this period, somebody has worked 6 months and now that person earns that bonus, this would load those into the system. All right. The other thing is importing from outside of the system. So a spreadsheet or a CSV of information out here. So a great example might be bonuses. You've got 50 employees getting a bonus. Certainly you could go into each employee, type in the amount they're going to get while you're doing this payroll entry here. But if you already have them in a spreadsheet, what we need is something like the employee ID or the social security number or SIN to identify who they are, what code you want to use, what income code, perhaps bonus, maybe there's incentive, I don't know, whatever it might be, the amount. And there's other things you could put on there like project and task and so forth. You can use this to bring in hours. In fact, if you have a time system that only exports stuff out as a CSV, this might be where you import that. You set it up and import that file into here. So you would browse, find that file, and import it in. And this is where you would also bring in deductions. So you want to bring in some deductions for your employees. You come out here. This one is a template that we provide. Let me show you what this looks like, where I can bring in some deductions for my employees. All right, so let me share this real quick. All right, so pretty straightforward with deductions. Employee number, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, whatever it is, the deduction code. Now, if I've already calculated payroll, it will populate these for me. So I don't have to remember what the codes are. It'll already be here. Is it an employee deduction? So be yes or no there. No means it's the employer amount. So you could have two lines in here if you're editing the employee and the employer amount. And of course, how much? This will be a one-time override of that deduction. So whatever, the situation is, you might need to override it. That's what this would be for. All right. And then, of course, once you save that, it will allow you to import it in, and it would update the deductions for those employees. All right. Let me switch back here. Okay. So once you have whatever you're going to be loading, importing into the system, you'll want to calculate your payroll. And this, depending on the number of employees and the complexity you have in here, might take a few moments to calculate. I have 300 employees, and hours and salary and those types of things are going to be calculated here. Now, this is doing the taxes and all the deduction calculations and those types of things there. It's also if there was allocated time against several projects, it's allocating all the deductions and taxes and everything. So this is doing all that hard work of calculating the payroll. Now, I will point out I could go somewhere else while this is processing. So if I needed to edit some other employee data, I can do that. Just be aware that if I change, let's say their taxes as it's calculating, I may not see it updated here. I might need to recalculate. So just, if you do go change something that might affect this, but it's not within the payroll process, not on these screens here, you might need to recalculate. So if I went to Sean and I changed his taxes, maybe he's in there as single with no dependents, and I change it to married with $2,200 or something like that, then I would need to recalculate, and it would recalculate his taxes. All right. So just be aware of that. But let me go into his record just to show you. Now, he's a salaried person. So just to set the table here. So I don't have any hours for him. I can enter in amounts or hours for this person. Now, this is a calculation, so I can't change that one. That's just how I have that in there. And of course, these codes here are probably not the same that you're used to seeing, but this is just what I have set up in my system here. So these are the default codes that are in my pay group. I can see there, different things. He has two jobs. That's why you see this here with two different rates for different things, because he has two different jobs out there. And there is his salary of $11.50. All right. And he has no hours for other things out there. So you can kind of see how that did. Now, if I wanted to add a bonus to him, like I said, I could have imported something, but maybe I wanted to give him $100 or something like that, I can go ahead and recalculate for him. All right, so good example of that. Now here's his taxes and deductions. So you can see this, he's in Oregon, there's his federal taxes, his state taxes, maybe local taxes that apply to him, whatever his situation is. Here are all his deductions. Now I have my system configured so that I can edit the deductions and employer amounts. You can set it so you can edit the taxes. There's a setting in your payroll that you can enable that if you would like to. I don't recommend leaving that on because it's easy to make a mistake and maybe incorrectly have taxes withheld or overpaid for the employee. All right, if I needed to override something, I could just click in and override, make this $5 or something like that, and then just recalculate. So if this is, of course, like a taxable or pre-tax, it might affect his taxes up here, and you'll notice the gross to net over here. All right, so very simple there. I did want to point out the gross up calculation. I'm going to go to somebody who doesn't have anything at all. Let's say Dylan here, I wanted to gross up a bonus for him to be $2,000. So that's how much I would like him to receive, $2,000. I'm going to use the bonus code, and this will do that calculation for how much do I really need to pay in a bonus to get him to $2,000. Here you'll see the net is 2,000. The gross is 3329.54 because all of these taxes and deductions are coming out. All right, so that's how you can do a gross up calculation on an employee if you need to. If there was an expense report I wanted to bring in individually, I could do that. He doesn't have any, but if I did, I could bring it in here. All right, I want to point out a couple of things and reports here before we wrap up. This export will export out all of the data for this payroll. So it's going to have all of the hours, the project, the task information in there, all of the incomes, deductions, taxes, employer deductions, and employer taxes, all in one big spreadsheet here. And let me show you what that looks like just very quickly, run through this. As somebody who puts up with Excel, I think this is a pretty good report here because I can look at this and I can really dig into all the details. Of course, I can do my filters and sorts and everything like that. So, maybe I ignore any zeros and I go through and I see, the information on these employees. As I mentioned, here's like the allocations and so forth. So I can see what's going on with these various folks down here. And then this is going to be the totals. So each employee is a row, each income code is a column. And we use that same pattern when we're looking at deductions, we're looking at taxes, employer deductions, and employer taxes. So this might be very helpful for you to analyze that data. And of course, there's reports you can run to show this as well. And I do want to also point out another export out here that is relatively new within the last 6 months. You may not have seen it before, is this comparison. This allows me to compare this payroll to a previous payroll. It's like the one from last week. All right, so this is going to, again, export out a spreadsheet. So we'll give it a second here to do that. And then I can look at this comparison here. I think this is great because it helps you to identify situations that might come up. So first off is just what is new in this payroll, what pay changes have happened. So here you can see this person, they are new in this payroll. They're in this batch. They weren't in the last one. Vice versa with this. Samantha Joan was in last one. She's not in this one. So I can see that right there. This would also show pay changes. Here I can see the gross and net. It is lower than the gross and net here. All right. And then we go to each sheet, just like the export, but now I'm comparing one payroll to the previous payroll and what's changed and how much is that variance here. So very easy to identify big changes out there. Maybe there's a massive increase in overtime on a person. You just want to make sure that the hours are right, or maybe somebody put in a pay rate wrong or something. Here you'll see the deductions, same thing, last time to this time. What's changed? Employer deductions, taxes, including the taxable wages, employer taxes, the net pay changes, and then this is everything. All those sheets kind of combined into one big, huge, massive file to look at this information if you need to. I love this one because it allows me to really identify problems very quickly. And before we wrap up, I do want to point out, why is it not showing my browser here? Hang on one second. There we go. So reports, get into a couple of reports, then we'll wrap up in here. So under payroll reports, there are many, many reports that you can run. Maybe you don't like those experts so much because you're not an Excel person, and that's fine. So you'll see things like deduction reports, garnishments, gross to net reports, incomes, overtime reports, pay date details and summaries, um, paycheck logs and stuff like that. So very easy to check all this information out. And of course, depending on the report you select, you're going to get various options out here for what you would like to, you know, put as your parameters. So like here, I can do this current pay period that I'm on. All right. And maybe I run it for just like one department or something like that. And I run that report. All right. Now, as I mentioned, there's many, many, many reports out there. So I don't want to run them all here because we're already short on time. But go ahead and run those there. When you are done and all of your reports, you've analyzed everything and you're happy with everything, you're ready to move forward, is when you would approve that payroll batch. So this is going to show you very easily or nicely up at the top the gross to the payroll total, which is your gross plus employer taxes and deductions, and all of the totals for each one of those different incomes, taxes, and deductions for both employee and employer. And then you approve the batch. And that's where you go to your payroll processing and you actually are cutting your paychecks if you have checks, and you're doing your direct deposit as well as your general ledger. So in here, this is the last step before they are actually paid and the payments are issued. So in here, you'll see where I can print my checks and I can generate my ACH. I don't want people to be late to your next meetings and so forth. I do appreciate you going a little overtime with me, but these are where you would run those processes there. Eventually, after I'm done that, there's a button down here that says complete payroll or complete batch. That would actually post it out to self-service. So the employee would get a notification. They could check on mobile as well. They'd be able to see their pay stub and everything like that. And then finally, depending on your tax situation, there might be where you're transmitting the taxes. You might be using Atrix. You might be self-filing. You have those different options out there. And the last step, of course, would be your GL. So whatever your GL system is, I happen to have mine hooked up to Sage Intacct. This is where I would transmit off that batch over to my Intacct in this example here. Now yours might be a download because you're not connected directly to your ERP, or you might be using a different system, and that's okay. I'm just going to show you an example. I would hit transmit here, and this is going to transmit over. I'll get a message here when it's done. All right. So, like I said, thank you for sticking around. Let's talk about what is coming up here. All right, so here's our upcoming schedule of events. So in a couple of weeks now, I maybe one of the, actually no, we're not changing until after Memorial Day because there's a holiday coming up after offer letters. We're making some adjustments there, but the years are upcoming schedule of events. Performance reviews in 2 weeks. We'll cover how you set those up and to actually do the performance reviews. As I mentioned while we were talking today, referral bonuses. This will be how it works, where you put them in on the candidate, and how you get that all the way through into payroll. Surveys. We've made a number of enhancements to surveys, including in the last update. So we want to make sure that you know how those all work and how to set them up. And then offer letters. Again, we've made a number of enhancements in offer letters. That will actually be after our latest release, which is coming in April here. So I think there's some changes that are even coming prior to this offering here. So we'll have the latest and greatest on our offer letters. All right, so I do want to thank you for joining us today. We appreciate your time. Hope to see you again in a couple of weeks. And if not, I hope you have a nice day and a wonderful weekend. Thank you so much.